Good afternoon. It's a pleasure being here. My second visit to Israel in the last 10 years, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to share some of my perspectives on agri-businesses and small farmer entrepreneurship. To be honest, I was a little worried being the last speaker on such an intellectually intense conference, and I was wondering what jokes I should crack to keep the audience awake. But I've not heard any snores, I've not seen any yawns, so I'll keep the jokes for another day. Well, I'll talk about fostering local entrepreneurship and agribusinesses from for smallholder farmers. And though I'll talk of an ICRISAT perspective, but I also take on a little bit of what I've seen and experienced in the private sector and the development sector in the past few years. So over the next 10-15 odd minutes, I'll talk about the imperatives. I think this is something which has been talked and reiterated quite a lot this afternoon, so I'll highlight a couple of points on this and move on. And I think why should we focus on inclusiveness? Why should we focus on gender? Why should we focus on small farmer holders? I think that's a theme which has been talked about, but I think what really matters is impact and scale. I'll talk of ICRISAT's model, what you call iMODe, inclusive market-oriented development, why and how that came about. Some, case study successes. It's not a concept only, but it's something which we've seen it happening on the ground. But I also like to take on this larger platform what's happening elsewhere. There are other organizations doing similar activities in the private sector, development sector, and I think that's all part of our learning and sharing, and I think it's always good to debate on some of these models. Yeah. So I think the first premise is not everyone was touched by the Green Revolution. There's still 700 million dryland inhabitants who are still poor, hungry, and malnourished. I think there's no mantra out there. The Green Revolution solved all the problems. We know that quite clearly. There's still rampant childhood malnutrition. We're still talking of a bulk of that malnutrition happening in Asia, which was again where the Green Revolution happened. We're still talking of 27% in sub-Saharan Africa. So in spite of the successes of the Green Revolution, we still have a paradoxical situation of hunger and malnourishment happening in South Asia. There's still pervasive poverty, 300 million people living on less than $1 a day, 700 million on less than $2 a day, and there's still significant yield gaps still exist between lab and farmer fields. So at one level, we've known that science does provide solutions, but we also realize over time that science probably is not the only solution. There are other solutions as well along the value chain. So I think it's important to realize that even CGR centers like ICRISAT are toying with the idea, hey, value chains, how do you get about that? So the big question which ICRISAT went through and they kept asking themselves is how can we reach the unreached, the small farmer. The cost of intervention was very high. The transaction costs were high to reach these small and marginal farmers, in spite of whatever the government system was over there. It's not that solutions were not tried before. There were a lot of solutions tried, but each solution had its own limitation. For example, subsidies. We heard a lot of people talk about subsidies, and we're talking of how sustainable these subsidies are. So it might be a good entry point, but it's at least a very bad exit as well. Land consolidation. People talked of economies of aggregation and farmer land holdings, etc. But then there are strong social implications to it. People don't want to pool on land like it's been a successful model in Israel, but I think in South Asia and parts of Africa it still doesn't work. Contract farming, again, it's a divided house on this. It's worked fairly well in certain countries, but it's flopped in other countries. There are challenges of large versus small farmer parity. The large farmer tends to get more of the benefit in a contract farming model when you're aggregating many of these players together. And poor producers cooperatives. We're talking of how effective some of these producer cooperatives are in terms of marketing. And government corporations. Some of them become very large, unwieldy, slow to respond. So some of these, there are successes, no doubt, but I think they're not a solution anymore. I think the time has come about to talk of innovation, talking of different approaches to address some of these concerns. Now, one clue came from the World Development Report 2008, which talked of a growth strategy for most agriculture-based economies has to be anchored on getting agriculture moving. So if you're talking of a GDP moving for any economy, agriculture has got to be moving as well. Food security was important, but agribusinesses would lead to a significant growth. So another comment which came out of this report was the private sector drives the organization of value chains. It's not the government, it's the private sector. It's a profit motive which drives these value chains. The states may put in laws and regulations to correct certain market failures, but they also have to support the greater inclusion of smallholders and women and rural workers in this network. So I think this was a thought which came about of how do we approach this large challenge that we talked about. And the quick question we keep asking ourselves was, why are these 700 million still poor and hungry in dry lands? And they had a fundamental approach which the previous speakers have talked about, and it was highlighted in the morning as well. When they don't have surplus income, they're not making market surpluses, so where do they invest? Where do they get money to invest? They can't produce food, enough food for the household, so where's the market surplus coming about? So they're stuck in this poverty trap and a hunger trap. At the same time, scientists know that potential does exist. But if you look at what Norman Borlaug has said, farmers can't eat potential, they need inputs, access to markets, and infrastructure and credit. So I think, therefore, what came out of this whole thinking was the need for an integrated end-to-end solution beyond pure R&D only. It rather had to be market-driven research, and there's a better chance of technologies being adopted if there's a market-driven approach towards it. So there was this major activity which ICRISAT underwent called the Strategy 2020, the Vision 2020, and they put up iMODe, Inclusive Market-Oriented Development. And they also said that to solve persistent hunger, small farmers needed both food and cash. So while subsistence farming gave them food, the cash had to come from some other means. It probably would be from additional rural livelihoods, but if it came from agriculture, and studies had shown the biggest impact on poverty would come out of enhanced agricultural productivity. So this was the basic premise, and markets had to play a pivotal role on this particular challenge. When ICRISAT and iMODe came about, it was a hypothesis of hope. It was an in-depth strategy review. It was challenging the traditional view, and ICRISAT's 40 years plus, and it's had a very traditional approach, but when you needed a grand challenge like this, you had to talk of a strategy revisit and a rejig. So this talked of productivity being one of the key fulcrums, no doubt, but talked of risk management, talked of marketable surplus, talked of markets, incomes. It talked of reinvesting for better inputs, and talked of post-harvest and policy approach. So it was something which ICRISAT had not done traditionally. It took off an entirely value chain approach in addressing this. It looked at a holistic approach versus a silo approach, which is being done in the past, and triggering of self-enforcing pathways to prosperity. So it's again in the high aridity index dryland areas in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa that I talked about. And there were some initial key validations, and even before 2010, talked of some testing kit of E-ELISA they did for aflatoxin testing in groundnut in Malawi. They talked of some high-yielding and disease-resistant varieties, which enable farmers to get better prices. They talked of a very large activity in watershed management, looking at water being a very critical resource. They looked at creating water user groups, self-help groups, and looked at crop diversification. So today that's a very large activity. But there were a lot of activities that came about that, because moving from our mandate crops of sorghum and legumes, we found that with additional water, the farmers could actually grow cash crops. He'd get into horticulture, he's able to make better returns on that. So these are some of the projects which enable ICRISAT to think out of the box, think bolder, look at strategies which were more market-driven now. Now, this is a very interesting ICRISAT diagram which talks a lot of how we're going to achieve this. So at one side, you find the higher the level of prosperity, you also find social assistance was the initial entry point, but you also had to create resilience among the farmers. There had to be a risk management mitigation tool for them to look at how to move out from subsistence farming to market-driven. So there would be that period where they would need support, a little bit of a risk management platform, and access to inputs and markets. But what was important was this wheel in between, which would churn, which would move towards prosperity, the wheels of prosperity. And it had to come out of higher value agriculture, it had to come out of harnessing markets. This would come out of markets purely. It would not come out of our traditional approach of developing varieties and giving it to the governments for distribution. That worked at a certain point in time, but this was, the context has evolved far more. It's much more market driven. So we need to harvest markets, reinvest gains, and manage risks. That was the ideology behind this. So like I said, the three main elements: harness markets that include the poor, make it totally inclusive, reinvest the gains in innovation that move smallholders along the development pathway, and manage risks that are stumbling blocks for the poor, building their resilience. So I think this was the driving ideology behind it. Now, I'd come to what has this led us to? Is it just pleasant words, new buzzwords, or has it actually reflected something on the ground? What ICRISAT did was a cluster-based approach, targeting smallholder women farmers to enhance the groundnut value chain. This was in the Doso region in Niger. It's an ongoing activity. And what the ICRISAT team did was networked. At one level, they found we had a solution with hybrid yielding varieties. But then it was important to organize these varieties in such a fashion, because what the women folk wanted there was high-yielding varieties with a higher oil content. And they would work on a certain technology, access oil, and try to market it. But we created clusters because we found there's a power of aggregation and looking at creating these varieties with more additional oil content, investing in a certain processing equipment, and then looking at an integrated approach and linking this to markets. So in a short span of time, something like about, in two years, we had about 35 clusters of 600 women each, and working this region. And this led to a higher price realization by 20%, livelihoods of over 6,000 women visibly improved, and it's spread by leaps and bounds to other regions. This was a strong impact story, there are many more, but this was something which I thought would make sense because it talked of smallholder farmers, it talked of entire market value chain from seed, processing, and linking it to the end consumer market in Niamey. I think the key success factor for this was technology was a given, but it was on the community mobilization. So that's where the partnerships came in terms of working with NGOs, but also in terms of partnerships with the end users in the cities, the traders who would work in terms of looking at an aggregated volume before, instead of dealing with 500 smaller women, they talk to just self-help groups to organize the supply chain. A lot of capacity building went through. They formed their own structures of an accountant, a president, a secretary, and who would look into a structure which, even when the project ended, was sustainable. The second intervention which I'd like to talk about was improved chickpea cultivars in AP and in Andhra Pradesh, in India, and in Myanmar. Now, this was a technological breakthrough, but it was lingering on because it didn't have a strong enough push at that point in time, because there was a market and the farmers were used to a very traditional variety. But when this variety came on, what was unique about it was it was harvested 30 days earlier, and it enabled a farmer to put a second crop in at an earlier space. So people moved from subsistence farming, drought and heat stress, low incomes, to an early maturing in wilt-resistant varieties. There was a strong government participation for testing, adaptation, release. A lot of farmer-level demonstrations were taking place, farm days and promotion. And today, these new varieties account for 80% of the area in Andhra Pradesh and India. There's been a 7 times increase in productivity and 3 times increase in area. Now, this has been pulled by markets in the neighboring states, but also the varieties have also moved on to other overseas destinations. In a place like Myanmar, these new varieties now account for 85% of the area. There's been a 2 times increase in productivity and 3 times increase in area with better markets. So this story is about technology working for the markets. And unless it was market-driven, these technologies would not have reached the scale that they have. There were success factors where you have to take away these clusters which worked in terms of business incubations, but also in terms of market linkages. In this, the second example, you talked of the NARS partnerships, which is very key because ICRISAT does not have the extension bandwidth to reach out to these millions of farmers. You had to use an existing platform, which is not very efficient, but it was effective at that point in time. There's still ways and means we have to look at ICT models to reach out to many more farmers. The challenge is still very large. And I think it's key that these varieties were accepted by the markets. Now, this is something which I talked about, the ICRISAT models, but I think this audience is also rich enough to, there's a lot of diversity in this room and a lot of other opportunities which I thought would share. And this is something which even somebody in the morning mentioned about, the bottom of the pyramid, the book written by C.K. Prahlad. And I was associated with this company called ITC Chopal in the past. They had this kiosk-based farmer intervention, which reached to something like 4 million farmers, which is market-linked. A lot of back-end extension took place. But the critical driving force for this initiative was the markets. And it looked at items like soybean, wheat, aquaculture, horticulture, and coffee. But being a large integrated corporation, they were able to create new products for the market. For example, this Ashirwad Atta, which is wheat flour, they were able to create a product which was homogeneous in the past, but because they had a very strong supply chain using eChopal and linking to the farmers at the back end, they were able to choose which varieties had a better blending quality and which markets would look at a differentiated product. So in other words, the wheat flour that you get in New Delhi would cater to the eating habits of the people of New Delhi, while what you get in South India would be a different blend. So in a span of 2 years, it got 50% market share. They're able to move a product which is standardized, homogeneous to a distinguished product, customized to a need. So which showed the power of from a seed right to a plate. The same thing happened in the biscuits example and the chips example, where they looked at back-end supply chains. There's another example which is, while the first example was purely ICT based, the kiosks were used. They had a physical infrastructure as well called the Chopal Sagar. The next example is Haryali Kisan Bazaar, which means the green farmers market. And they had a team of 800 agronomists. They had a bricks and mortar model. They put up about 400 stores, physical stores in rural areas in India. And these stores would cater not only to agricultural inputs, but anything which a rural community would want. So you probably get mobile phones, cooking utensils, clothes, shoes, etc. So it was a rural shopping mall. There we have the Tata farmer yards, which again focused on fertilizer inputs and advisory service. So each of them had a different business model around it, and each of them have reached a certain level of scale. I think it's important to note that you could have successful pilots elsewhere, but businesses run for scale and profit, and this is what drove some of these models. There's something else. The NCDEX commodity futures market in India is catering special contracts for smallholder farmers and crops which can be aggregated through a farmer holding group to take part of these future markets. Talking of warehousing, warehouse receipts coming through, so the farmers can keep to produce in a warehouse, get 60% bank financing against it to clear off his short-term loans, and sell it at a later date at a higher price. We've heard cases about the Reliance, the Walmart, the Metro success chains in India where they worked backwards on the supply chain, aggregating with farmers, the branded front-end retail. So a housewife, when she buys produce in some of these retail, these malls, is assured of quality, freshness, which would probably not be available in the traditional formats. Pepsi's model of potato, rice, and quinoa is fairly well known in South Asia. They're also doing direct extension work on direct seeded rice and farm extension. There's a small farm mechanization. John Deere's collaborating with smaller companies in India for small farm equipment, moving away from the larger tractors to some farm-held implements. And there's pure ICT play models. You all know about the M-Pesa model in Kenya, the digital green model, which is on video-based, farmer-to-farmer video-based activities. Reuters Monitor Lite, which is a very interesting model. It's reached something like about a couple of million farmers already in terms of mobile-based advisories coming to the farmers. It's at a cost. None of these are subsidy-driven. They're all business models. They're accountable, they make money, or they're trying to make money. IFCO Kisan. So a lot of these models are going around. So having said that, I would say that when you look at these models of be it an iMODe or be it an eChopal or be it digital green, I think at one level, if you look at who your end customer really is, your key beneficiary is a farmer. So if you're looking at him first, he's now making a market-aligned production. It's higher productivity and better farm gate prices. I think that's a key driver for his sustainability. For the researchers and the government system, they're looking at market-driven varieties now, considered different from a top-down approach. While it's good to have technologies which address the real challenges, like we talked about Striga in the morning and the various wills, but I think it's also something how you integrate it with traits the farmer also wants. For the corporates, I think it's a very effective procurement of quality farm produce, be it aggregated through small farmers or farmer groups. For donors, there's a visible impact, transparency. They like to see these numbers which come out of these alliances. And for the nation, I think we're talking of if agriculture is doing well, economies do well. So that's the broad picture really I'd like to talk about. So the key message really is in terms of the CGR systems are known for high-end science. But I think along the line they realize that high-end science alone is not a solution. We need to integrate it to a lot of other activities along the value chain. And if you keep two key elements in mind, what is the trends in the market and what are the farmers' needs, you probably have a good winning model around that. So that's what I'd like to share. Thank you.